Dear friends, let's read of Ducks and Geese written by R.M. Rajgopal. These stories have specifically been picked from the book named Time Wrap Stories from Middle India. So they kind of take you back to that nostalgic era. So let's begin with the story. A midwinter bird shoot is an experience for both soul and body. The best time to get at them is at first light, for that's when they lazily flap their wings from their roosting places at night in the middle of a lake or a slow flowing river and amble their way through the air towards the field. The early bird and worm principle. This is why, for the physical part of one's being, it is a true awakening. When the target locale is about an hour's ride away and one has to take his position by the lakeside well before sunrise, it means crawling out of bed at 4 or thereabouts. You have a half hour with you for your morning ablutions and a cup of strong hot coffee. The coffee doesn't just help wake you up, its take intake seems essential, especially when the mode of conveyance is a motorcycle. For during the journey, the headwind seems to make a habit of sneaking its way in through the whatever warm cladding you are, ensconced in, and you are invariable end up cursing it and yourself for embarking on such an expedition. Quite an exercise in willpower, which is why you have got to really enjoy this sort of thing to be able to do it. For the soul, I often feel like it is an experience in atavism. The sounds, the sights, and the smells of the jungle at daybreak as the first soft rays of the winter sun filter down to the cold, damp earth throughout the layers of early morning mist, which seem to trigger off certain primordial instincts that hark back to some hoary ancestor stalking game millennia ago. The ancient savage within, papered over by centuries of so called civilization, surfaces in a subdued and not unfriendly fashion as one adapts each time, as if by the instincts of forgotten generations, to the ambience around of the waking jungle at dawn. The atavism apart, I sometimes wonder at the pleasure that I seem to derive from such jaunts, for I am essentially from staunch vegetarian stock. Not that I am one too. Nothing like a roast goose for dinner, grey lag preferably, one that has flown all the way from the Siberian steppes to our table. It is at times like these that I marvel at the phenomenon of bird migration and, more importantly, find myself thankful that it occurs. Thankful for both the shooting and the eating. But let me clarify, I am not much of a shot myself. I go along for the experience, and of course, I am wholehearted about partaking in the fare afterwards. It was an encouraged group, the foursome that set up early that wintry morning. Two true blooded Rajputs, father and son, a Bengali and a Malayali, shades of national integration, in the heartland of what was once the Rajputana of yore, in the kingdom of Kota, the edge dropped, has robbed the name of much of its romance and its grandeur. Anupam, the Bengali with a newly acquired gun license, had been diligently taking pot shots at tin cans outside our large courtyard for many days. The clink of pellet on tin had improved from 1 in 6 to 1 in 3 on an average over the days. Cartridges were expensive and hard to come by, but Anupam had both the spare cash and the resources. His gun wasn't a very good one, we were told, but it would do. After 2 weeks of preserving practice, Anupam was now ready for the real thing. Shooting flying game was different from aiming at tin cans. I think he knew that. Gopal Singh, the leader of this group of four, was quintessential Rajput. Short in nature, squat in appearance, and not very good looking. He possessed an infectious smile that was more than made up for the externals. He was a sort of father figure to all of us novice shikaris and a tough, demanding teacher. His unfailing test of our resolve and, more importantly, of our physical resilience was to invite us casually for a daytime shoot in midsummer when, as he used to say, the horses were lean, fast, and made for superb eating. At 44 degrees Celsius in the shade, the test take its toll and more. I ought to know. tongue parched, the top of my head feeling as if the brain inside was boiling, the ground hot and unyielding even through thick soled shoes. At the end of the day, when all of us looked like we had been lost in the desert without food or water for a week, Gopal Singh would be as spirited as ever and just as charming, ready for a lazy evening of swilling chilled beer and swapping stories on the large veranda that ran around the front of his farmhouse. And yes, the hares made for superb eating. Always even tempered, it was amazing that in all the time that I had known him, I had never known him to lose his cool. The loudest I had heard his voice raised was when reprimanding one of the half dozen or so dogs that inhabited his dwelling, angry at some canine misdemeanor. A good Rajput, as anyone would tell you, grows up to the sound of gunfire, of the cannons and muskets of war in the old days, but of late, more of buckshot fired out of a double barreled gun, spraying pellets into and around birds passing around. Shikar to them is like football is to the average Bengali or Malayali. The months from November through March focus on this activity, and the latest flight of geese spotted at sunset veering towards this or that lake in the vicinity causes as much excitement and expectation as an impending East Bengal Bagan soccer encounter. The way the gun butt rests light and sure on the shoulder, and the way you barely see it kick as the weapon is fired surely requires as much skill as a swerving dribble into the D. My Bengali friend's skills with the gun and accuracy in marksmanship, from what little I had seen, would compare favorably with how the average Rajput would play soccer, more often than not, lacking the subtle fineness and the comprehension of the nuances that get you on target. The ride from town to our destination was all of 30 kilometers. The way was still dark as we proceeded at an even gentle pace. Gopal Singh didn't believe in living life in a hurry. Besides, his scooter couldn't go much faster for it. It was a weather beaten vehicle, 10 summers old, that had seen much early mornings. The first half of the journey took just half an hour. The last 10 kilometers, when we turned off the regular road, involved traversing an ancient, well used, deep rutted cattle track where the path was so worn as to have become a gentle concave. Balancing the motorcycle along its contours was almost like riding a continuous shallow well of death. The bike constantly swung lightly from side to side, and in the darkness, with Anupam on the pillion behind me, clutching at his precious new gun for dear life. Staying upright was quite a task. The pace was slow, and at times I had to place my foot down as we negotiated a corner, covering my boots and half my trouser leg with a spray of grey brown dust that was finely ground by years of use as well as feet hoofs and cart wheels. As we rode along, the first grey blue streaks of the half light of early dawn fell on green squares of wheat interspersed with white patches of bright yellow mustard. The trees were a variety peepal, mimosa, gulmohar, also the occasional mango grove. The large grey black buffaloes that almost always shared one's path along these country tracks, lumbering on in an uncomprehending herd that was difficult to navigate even on a motorcycle, were yet to venture out. So were the young children who later in the day would either peep from behind the hedges or trees, or if we stopped, would cluster around looking at us through large eyes, accentuated by the gauntness of their faces. One of the bolder ones would often dart forward, stroke the motorcycle, and flit away for fear of being reprimanded. A kilometer or so away from our destination, the track ended. We parked our vehicles under a large tree, loaded the 3 guns that we had brought along with us, and with their safety catches on, started our walk towards the river. The light was barely enough for us to see where we were going. We trusted in Gopal Singh's usually unerring instinct for direction as he took us long, narrow track. There was hardly any grass underfoot, and no sign of cultivation, for agriculture had slowly given way to the wilderness. The scrub jungle around us, dry by day, glistened with early morning dew. It is at this hour, betwixt night and day, when the jungle is yet to stir when the earliest bird is yet to venture out, when even the crickets are soundless, that one experiences the true quality of silence, an all pervading silence, where even the rustle of her shoes along the path seemed somehow a discretion, when even a whispered word seems profanity, when the stillness has a quality of eternity that transcends the humdrum of living, a silence that gives solace even as a memory. The Kali Sindh, though not quite as forbidding as its sister, the Chambal, is a ravine river like the latter. Over millions of years, it has cut deep through the land, forming a maze of ravines, some shallow, some deep, that have traditionally provided excellent cover for the dacoit gangs that roam the countryside 100 miles further downriver. It was a good 10 minutes before we reached the edge of the river and looked down at the river, some 50 feet below. The sun was yet to show itself above the horizon. The timing, Gopal Singh said, was perfect. The river waters, grey in the half light, flowed smooth and calm, just ideal for a large flight of birds to roost upon. We walked quietly along the cliff edge, and sure enough, just 200 yards upstream was a sizable flock of geese floating serenely on the water. Grey lag, whispered Gopal Singh, who was standing next to me. The banks of the rivers were bare of any vegetation, of even shrubbery. We had no cover at all as a result, and going down to the bank anywhere near the flock would have meant getting spotted within seconds. Geese are very alert birds. Maybe they realize how delectable they are as food, and generations of being hunted relentlessly makes them extra cautious. The situation was tricky. That was when Gopal Singh's years of experience at this sort of thing asserted. It was just as a seasoned cricket captain would position a square leg here and a point there, an extra cover already in place to hold to any uppish drives. He instructed his son Siddharth to go further upriver beyond the flock of birds on the water. We would be positioned 100 yards further downstream from where we stood. Well out of seeing, hearing, and sensing range of the flock, Siddharth would climb down to the river bank with as much stealth as possible, move as close as he could to the birds without being observed, and empty both barrels in the general direction of the flock. The birds would instinctively fly downstream away from the noise of the gunshot, right over us. We could very well bring down 6 fat ones, considering that Anupam and Gopal had 2 barrels and 4 rounds between them. All this was said in something akin to a stage whisper. Siddharth caught on quickly and moved away, melting into the early morning mist that was now starting to rise from the river. We went 100 yards further downstream and made our way gingerly down the steep embankment towards the river bank. Gopal Singh admonished us, finger on his lips, indicating that we were not to make a sound. He signaled to Anupam to move 20 yards or so further upstream. We remained where we were, and the two of us, Gopal Singh and I, sat comfortably on conveniently placed slabs of flat rock, waiting for the gunshot in the distance. You can smoke if you want to, he whispered. It is going to take some time for Sidhu to reach there. He didn't smoke himself. I was glad he sympathized with my addiction. I lit up and took a long drag as we spoke to each other in low tones. I hope Anupam shoots well, he whispered. I can't say for sure, I replied. He has been practicing hard. I suppose it shouldn't be very difficult. He doesn't have to aim at a single moving target. He's only got to shoot in the general direction of the flock. The first geese of the season, said Gopal Singh. Let's have a party tonight. Have you ever tasted my stuffed roast goose? No? Well, I can assure you that you will enjoy it. I looked towards Anupam. He was glancing at us every now and then, seemingly restless. He was a fidgety person in any case. Even if Anupam shot, why it didn't matter, I told myself. I was thinking in the context of a roast goose for the table that evening. Gopal Singh is bound to bring down at least a couple. I thought I could sense a gleam in his eyes as he thought of the evening's dinner. Saddlebags loaded with 6 fat ones was a great way to start the season. 6 fat ones that I had fed well on the wheat fields for more than a month, the flesh rippling under the cover of feathers. Not that the help at his farm would experience much joy at the sight of his trooping in, for cleaning these birds is strenuous work, but better than 2 chinks, a blue bull, a dozen rabbits, and a wild boar, which would have been an average bag 50 years ago. In the olden days, distribution to sundry relatives and friends was the norm. Today, a spacious deep freezer took care of that problem. It was about 10 minutes later that Gopal Singh tensed. He motioned me to keep still. I extinguished my cigarette and squatted, crouching beside the jutting rock on which we had been sitting. Anupam, who was looking our way, was alerted with a brief wave of the arm. Any moment now, Gopal Singh told me. Less than a minute later came the sound of Siddharth's gun in the distance. The huge flight took off from the water in a flutter of wings. For a few moments, the birds went helter and skelter, until after gaining a reasonable height, they went into the formation. As Gopal Singh had predicted, they started to fly downstream right our way. Gopal Singh was ready, crouched into firing position. His gun was on his shoulder, and his eyes squinted along the barrel, ready to spring up in time and shoot all in one fluid motion. I glanced at Anupam. He was half up already, weapon in hand, looking upwards. The birds formed a neat V. They would be over us in 10 seconds at best, and they hadn't spotted us. The evening's roast goose seemed more real. Suddenly, the sound of gunfire. I saw Anupam standing up, his gun emitting smoke. He had fired both barrels prematurely before the birds were actually on top of us. A noisy flutter of wings, and the flock veered away from us and flew out over the bank. The lead bird flew straight over us. Perhaps its momentum was too much for it to control itself. I looked closely at it as it flew overhead. No wonder it seemed smaller than the rest. A duck leading a flight of geese. How peculiar. So, friends, this is the end of the story. Please stay tuned for some more new stories.